following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
That's not really the case. You have to go learn about something else and join some other industry, and then make the conscious decision to leave that industry and join crypto. So everyone who's here actually wants to be here, which is not the case in almost every other industry where people just hate their jobs because they just fell into it. You don't fall into crypto. You have to make a decision to come here.
We are like astronauts, floating in the space of time, lost between past and future.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Red Sheehan, Protocol Research Analyst at Messari. If you've been following the GRTiQ podcast, you're likely familiar with other members of the Messari team who have joined us before, including CEO and founder Ryan Selkis, Engineer Manager Vincent Wen, and Director of Research Mihai Grigore. And as I'm sure you already know, the Messari team is one of the core dev groups working on the graph. As you're about to hear, Red has some unique and valuable perspectives on Web3. During our conversation, he talks about his journey into Web3 and his introduction to the industry. We also explore his research on protocols, touching on various themes I haven't explored on the podcast before. You'll also hear Red share some valuable insights on cryptography, his perspective on the recent developments within the Bitcoin community, and his views on the graph. We begin by talking about Red's educational background.
My educational background is in electrical and software engineering. It didn't start that way. I did biomedical at first, I think, and then I did a switch over, and programming was always pretty fun. I started doing that when I was like 14, so I ran with it in college.
Do you remember what got you started so early in programming? I'm always curious, and it's another familiar theme on the podcast of people like you who got a real early start. So what got you started?
Yeah, I had a class at my high school, and it kind of just sounded fun, so I'd check it out. Like, sure, I'll take a class in that. And we started making games in Java, and I'm like, all right, this is sweet. And I never got super into it, but it's something I always did a little bit of until I switched my major over to it, really made it a career choice.
So if we go back to this time in your life and maybe project forward, I mean, what were you thinking about in terms of your career? What were you envisioning to do from a professional or career standpoint?
The vision for my career is a little tough because I think the idea of a dream job is ephemeral. My dream job 3 years ago is something I so would not want to be doing right now. And I will probably have a different dream job in a few more years or later in life. So that always evolves. There are some constants or overlaps, I'd say. I like math-based things. So like the algorithms part, like it's puzzles, basically. I always thought that was pretty fun. So I'll maybe rotate around a few core themes. I like working with people. I like the consumer-facing end of working with products. So a few things I'll rotate between, but I'd say those are a couple of mainstays that I started with and I'll probably keep going with.
If you think back to the things you were studying then as you were pursuing software engineering, software programming, did you see or encounter any themes or topics related to Web3, blockchain, crypto? I mean, distributed systems, things like that?
Not necessarily, although it's interesting because a lot of the stuff that I worked on in university that I totally did not care about and was not interested in, I'm really happy I did them now. Like that knowledge has become so useful to me. Things like very low level programming, like coding in assembly and working with logic design, like the actual logic gates when you're working on some hardware stuff. And I always thought that was such a drag because I just wanted to build like games. But now that I'm trying to play with low level programming in the crypto world, like BitVM or some Bitcoin script, low level languages or memory allocation and things like that, it's actually really nice to have that background. So at the time, I did not think about these things, but it's become pretty useful.
So Red, I'm certainly non-technical, and I think some of my audience as well. So can you explain what you mean by low-level coding, low-level programming? What is meant by that, and what's different?
Yeah, totally. So computers read ones and zeros. We don't work with binary. We like words and things we can read and understand. So you need to, get from one end to the other. You can use a high level language where you're basically just writing words and that compiles down into maybe just basic instructions that are add or subtract or simple things. So you have these kind of tiers where, what we like to use are high level languages where you can actually, like I said, use words, and then you have in between things like straight up instructions, which would be something like assembly, or Bitcoin script is just a bunch of opcodes and instructions that aren't really intuitive to read. And then at the bottom, it's really just ones and zeros.
So if we try to unpack a little bit of why you might be passionate about programming and software, and you mentioned there it was a little bit like puzzles for you, but how would you explain what drew your interest or passion in this?
I think a lot of people would agree with me if they've done some programming, but I find it to be artistic, which sounds a little silly at first if you're thinking of it as some utilitarian, like I need to get some task done kind of thing. But there are infinite ways to write an algorithm to do any one thing. So your personal tendencies and flair kind of comes out. Like you do have a writer's voice with writing code. So even just a simple algorithm, there's usually not a best way to do it. There's just a lot of good ways to do it, and no two ways are the same. So that artistic aspect is pretty fun.
Red, what did you do after university then?
After university, I started working for Bacardi, the liquor company. They're based out of Miami, and that was super fun. It was exactly what it sounds like. It's a family-owned company by the Bacardis, and they rock. And I was doing websites and mobile apps and stuff for them. And I did that for about 2 years.
That sounds like a super fun job. So then let's talk about when you become aware of crypto. Take us back in time. Do you remember when that was?
I became truly aware of crypto maybe November, December 2021, which I knew what crypto was. I'd heard of it, in maybe 2015 in college. And I think I used it once or twice, but I never kept any of it. And I didn't pay close enough attention. I really thought it was just money, which was cool. And I liked the, privacy aspects of that, but I didn't really see the big picture until a friend hit me up and he's like, yo, Red, can you make me an NFT? I'm like, I don't know. What's an NFT? And he starts explaining and he's like, hey, you do it in Solidity. And I'm like, well, what's Solidity? He's like, it's like JavaScript. And I'm like, okay, I can do it. And maybe 6 weeks after that, I quit my job and was freelancing in smart contract development because I realized, whoa, there's this whole other side of it. You can program stuff. It's not just money. It's a whole credibly neutral platform. Like you put whatever you want on it. And I'm like, all right, this is what I want to be doing. And I jumped in really fast.
Yeah, and it totally sounds like that. So if we then think about similar to how we were talking about what your passion or draw was to software engineering, if you zoom out and think about what drew your interest or your passion towards crypto, how would you explain that?
Yeah, so software I thought was cool, but I don't know if it was something I was passionate about in general. That's incredibly vague. Even just saying you're a software engineer is incredibly vague without mentioning the industry. But crypto caught me because of that decentralization ethos, I think, and the censorship resistance. So I think I was always a bit of a privacy maxi in terms of like, I still don't use Face ID. I didn't use Face ID on my phone for so long until I took time to look into a secure enclave and realize like, all right, I'm not actually handing out my biometrics to, whoever makes my phone, but things like that. I always thought that was weird. And I was always a little hesitant to get on board with some of the new tech just because it felt a little invasive. So when I found this whole category of technology and the things people were building with it, I said, oh, this is perfect. And I saw the demand for developers. And I said, oh, that's perfect for me. I can just kind of jump in.
Talk to us about that transition. You mentioned a friend asked you to do a couple things. You figured out how to do it, learned a couple things along the way. What was that transition like going from your Web 2 experience and moving and getting started into Web 3?
The cool part is that everything is open source, which means it's really easy to learn how to build something. I find something that's cool. Oh, I need something like that. All right, let me go look at the code. How'd they make it? That open source ethos, it's not really an ethos. It's kind of enforced to some degree. Not everything is open sourced. You can have unverified contracts and your front end can be closed down if you have centralized batchers or whatever. But the smart contract itself, if you want to verify it and put it on chain, well, everyone can go look at it. So I would go look at things, and I started in Ethereum, which has a ton of documentation and resources and YouTube videos. So that part actually wasn't too hard. And a lot of people were looking for devs to build simple stuff. They said, hey, I just want an ERC 721 contract, like a standard NFT contract. And we have some better tools today where you can kind of do that with no code. But a few years ago, it was a little harder. So people were just looking for really simple stuff. And I said, I can get my feet wet that way. And, I increment up.
If we accept decentralization as being one of the core themes or one of the things that kind of draws people to this space, how would you explain to somebody that's non-technical or just trying to learn why something like decentralization is important?
That is the really tough part. Because when you explain the value of these decentralized and distributed systems, people are like, all right. And I'm like, no, but you own it. It's actually yours. And because that is what everyone thinks the current system is. You think if you own a share of Google stock that you own it. You don't. Fidelity owns it and you own an IOU. It's a little bit different. But we all think the current financial system works the way crypto does.
And if we apply the same question to privacy, explaining why privacy might be an important component, how would you describe or explain why privacy is important or how it factors into Web3?
Privacy is a tough one. I feel like I fight a losing battle just by liking privacy. People are very reactive. Privacy is very proactive. If you wait until you need privacy, it is too late. So you almost have to build these things in at the base layer and like sneak them into people and say, yeah, use it that way. But privacy is different in crypto than it is in Web 2 because privacy in Web 2 is usually the job of some centralized custodian. If you look at a VPN, everyone's traffic is routing through, maybe a centralized server that runs the VPN. But if not that, definitely the company. You have a honeypot of credit cards and, billing information. So yes, it's private, but only through one lens. And if you look at a mixnet, which is something a little bit more similar to Tor, the onion router with, maybe some better encryption standards and entropy, you are private against everyone in the system, not just the people on the other end. You're also private against the people in the system, which it's a peer-to-peer system. So usually your users are also providers, things like that. But that kind of idea really carries over to a lot of the different things we can build with peer-to-peer networks like money, crypto.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTiQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the graph.
Roger that.
Well, I want to ask you this follow-up question about VPNs. Are VPNs a little bit of a false flag in terms of security in Web 2?
A VPN maybe fits a different use case. So if I wanted to protect my identity from the person on the other end, or, deceive them, if I wanted to tell Netflix, I'm in France, so let me watch the show that's listed for people in France because it's not listed in the States. That's a great use case. And that is full privacy in that sense. But in the case of a peer-to-peer mixnet, you would be private not only from the person at the other end, but from the people in the middle, which is the people running the mixed nodes. You're not private from the people in the middle in the case of the VPN. It's a little bit of that, trust me, bro, we're not going to share if we get subpoenaed or anything like that.
Okay, Red, so you got started full-time in Web3 in 2022. Talk to us about how you got started and what you were doing.
Yeah, I jumped on Upwork and found any gigs I could because I used to do a little freelance work on Upwork for Web2 stuff, like robotic process automation, just forms and automating, menial tasks for people's businesses. And I said, all right, I'm on Upwork. Let me find some jobs. It was really difficult because everyone wanted to pay in crypto, which meant you either had to figure something else out or violate the terms of service. So that was tough in its own right. But I was finding Upwork gigs. And after a few of those, just word of mouth, because crypto is a small world. And that brought me to ETHDenver in February or March of 2022, where I found a team, worked on the hackathon, and was completely sold. Just the culture at that conference, I was so in. If I had any doubts before that, they were gone.
You mentioned that ETHDenver and the culture there sort of sparked your interest and was a hook to getting you more interested. Obviously, ETHDenver just concluded, and I know you were there. When you think back to that first event and the most recent one, how have things changed and evolved at ETHDenver?
I think I loved ETHDenver in 2022, but when I talked to some of the stewards, they were like, no, that was a bad year. We were so unorganized. And I loved every year the last 3 years. But if you talk to some other people, the organization was pretty bad in the start, and it was pretty great this past year, a month ago. So I guess it has developed in that sense, but it's been going on for a while. And I think culture-wise, it's still the same kind of festival that it was back then.
Did you get a sense at this year's ETHDenver that things are back? I mean, the market's doing interesting things, and there's a lot of talk about coming out of the bear. Are we back?
Oh, I got that feeling. Yeah, the vibes there were, we are so back. It was a little euphoric. Everyone was having a little too much fun with it. Not too much fun, but I thought it was a blast. The energy was so there.
So soon after getting started in Web3, you co-founded and acted as CTO at MoonLab. Was this your first entrepreneurial venture? And talk to us a little bit about what that experience was like and what you did there.
Absolutely. If you don't count being an NFT mercenary dev and making tokens, this was my first entrepreneurial venture. And I met some people through a friend of a friend, and we just basically cooked up a design agency where, you bring us an idea, we give you a smart contract and a DApp and marketing and a brand kit, and we will help you, run your podcasts, whatever you want to do marketing wise. We'll just get you from 0 to 1. And I had a ton of fun building out other people's projects like that. We didn't do it for too long, but I thought it was a pretty valuable learning experience for all of us involved.
And what was that experience like of becoming an entrepreneur? And part of the reason I want to know is clearly you left an established industry for a new industry. And then within that new industry, you decided to do a new thing and become an entrepreneur. So there's a lot going on here. So talk to us about that. What was that experience like going to be an entrepreneur in an emerging industry?
Oh, yeah. I mean, grass is always greener. When I was working for someone else, I'm like, I want to work for myself. And when I was working for myself, I'm like, I don't even have time to write code. I'm busy trying to run this thing. And that's what I wanted to do. So you realize it's a cool idea on paper, but then there's a lot more to it. So doing it for that first time kind of made me realize, in which directions I might want to be part of a team or lead a team or be on my own.
So then what did you learn about the nature of entrepreneurship by virtue of this experience? What are the 1 or 2 lessons you'd like to pass on to listeners that might be interested in the same thing?
I think the team you are working with is more important than the product you are working on, because good ideas are kind of a dime a dozen, but getting a team together is a little bit tougher.
So what'd you do, Red, after MoonLab?
After MoonLab, I was spending a lot more time writing. So to get into this space, I'm like, I got all these things to learn about, and I don't even know what I want to work on yet because I don't understand the whole space. So I was spending so much time trying to learn about stuff. And prior to being in crypto, I was very interested in personal finance. And I was always trying to teach my friends how to make an IRA and do this and that. And I was making budgets for them and all that stuff. And I ended up just turning that into a blog because I was sending the same information to different friends over and over. So I made this finance blog. And it slowly turned into, here's a tutorial on how to make an NFT and how to make a minting dApp. And this is where I stored the data. Like this gateway works for IPFS and all these different things. And that turned into, well, today I'm learning about Monero. So I'm going to write a report about it and put it on my blog where maybe one person will read it. If you can't teach something, you don't understand it. So I filled in a lot of those knowledge gaps when I tried to write it down because I was writing. I'm like, maybe I don't understand it as well as I thought. And that kept happening as I kept learning. And pretty quickly, I was spending a lot more time teaching than I was writing code or doing anything else. And that is where this sort of evolution happened between my profession being a developer and my profession being a research analyst.
If we think back to your passion and interest in personal finance and we bolt on the things that might be possible or how that might change in a environment like Web3 with crypto and different things like that, how do you think Web3 and crypto impact things like personal finance?
I think crypto is more so just adding another dimension to personal finance. The root of it doesn't change too much because the root of the personal finance things that I were interested in is that at a basic level, hey, you can invest your money and you can be doing something with it rather than letting inflation eat it away in a bank account. And investing is this black hole of scary if you come from a family that doesn't talk about investing and your friends don't talk about it or people just don't know about it. It's kind of this black box. A lot of people will have a 401k and they'll say, yeah, my money's invested. A 401k is an investment vehicle. It's not a specific investment, but a lot of people surprisingly don't know that. So you kind of need to bridge that gap. So I don't know if crypto revolutionizes that aspect of it, but it is another dimension of once you kind of open your eyes to what you can be doing, this is one of the avenues.
One thing I think about when it comes to personal finance and crypto is this idea of staking and earning rewards. And I think that could over time become like a passive income play for a lot of people who haven't become exposed to crypto yet. But how do you think about that? I mean, when you think about personal finance, you think about staking. Do you see it impacting or playing a role in personal finance?
I think staking is a reason that ETH is very attractive to traditional finance. And BTC is obviously the favorite of TradFi. Before the ETFs, we knew that. But I'm of the opinion that ETH is the clear second favorite. And yield is what everyone wants in the TradFi world. I mean, that's the end state. That's the golden thing that we want at the end. People want yield. They won't stop at spot also. So I think we're going past these ETFs. But with Ether, you get yield. That is something you don't natively get through staking or some other mechanism like that, BTC. So I think staking, like you said, like a dividend almost, is something that TradFi finds is familiar and they will want.
So, Red, you're doing writing and research on personal finance. You're working in Web3, learning all the things along the way. What's then the backstory for how you ended up going to work at Messari?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, I realized, hold on, I'm writing research and education way more than I'm writing code. Maybe I should just do this. I'm spending all of my time on it. So I kind of looked around at who would be hiring for this, who are the companies. I followed Messari's newsletter, and they were the only team I decided to apply for. Actually, if I did not get a job there, I was going to keep being independent and working on my own. But they got back to me, and within a week, I was working there. It happened really quick. We were doing interviews on back-to-back days. And the pitch was kind of, hey, I saw this job opening. I already do this on my own all day. Here's 60 articles on base layer architectures and all these other things that I wrote in the past 6 or 8 months. How about I do it for you? And, it was a perfect fit.
And that decision of going to work at Messari, you were a freelancer, you were an entrepreneur. Now you're giving all of that freedom up, you could argue, and going to work for a big company like Messari, very well established, very well respected. What drove that decision? And take us behind the scenes there of what you were thinking.
Yeah, I really wanted to work with a team rather than to keep working alone. In the beginning, when I was working alone, the knowledge was going parabolic. It was awesome. I was working like 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. The weeks were disappearing. I was having so much fun learning about all this. But you get diminishing returns at some point. That learning curve plateaus a little. And there's a quote I like that's, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I decided, I think I've gotten what I can out of just ripping through this stuff solo. And I really want to join up with a team, because you really do feed off that energy from other people and you learn a lot from others. So I wanted to get hooked up with some killers.
Most listeners of this podcast will know who and what Messari is, and members of the Graph ecosystem recognize that Messari is one of the core dev teams working on the Graph, making a lot of contributions as it relates to subgraphs and subgraph development. But for those that don't know, do you mind just explaining who and what Messari is?
The short answer is Messari is the Bloomberg of crypto. The slightly longer answer is Messari does research and some news aggregation and a little bit of data work to try to take this industry of crypto and make it a little bit more transparent, because all data is on chain anyway. Everything's out there. We're not dealing with black boxes or opaque centralized entities. Everything exists in accessible fashion. So let's create some standards and add a little more clarity to this mess of heterogeneous architecture out there.
And what's your role at Messari? And talk to us about the research you're doing.
I'm a research analyst that covers primarily base layer protocols. So that would be like a Bitcoin or a Cardano or layer 2 like zk-Sync or Stacks. And I will cover technical updates, try to take some of the things that come from the developers, make them digestible to an everyday reader who is busy or has other interests and doesn't want to spend all their time learning about what a data availability layer is and does it matter. So I'll cover those qualitative aspects, and then I'll pull in the data as well and say, here's what's happening. Here's how to make sense of some of these numbers. Here's what you can compare one-to-one. Here's what you can't, stuff like that.
Well, Red, I think some of the vocabulary terms and concepts in Web3 are shifting and evolving with the industry, and sometimes it gets confusing. So help us understand a little bit here what is meant by base layer. You're doing research on base layer, and give us some context for how we should think about that.
Sure. So I use the word base layer there just to describe a network itself in terms of its own blockchain, whether it's a layer 1 or layer 2. And that would be differentiating from a Uniswap, which is a DeFi protocol that's built on top of the layer, or maybe some middleware like Chainlink is something you would use in addition to a DeFi protocol like Uniswap. And that could be on a base layer, whether it be an Ethereum or an Arbitrum.
So the right way to think about a base layer then is that it's kind of the transaction layer. I mean, if I got that right, it's still, I guess, a little confusing to even me.
Yeah, a base layer is just its own network, I suppose. You know, Uniswap is a protocol. It's not its own network. Chainlink is a protocol. It is sort of its own network, but not in the crypto blockchain sense.
So tell us about the day-to-day work of a research analyst at Messari. I mean, is that work you're enjoying? Is it everything you hoped it would be? Talk to us about what you do.
Oh, it's so fun, man. I just learn about stuff and then teach about it pretty much over and over and over. It's awesome. There are a few other things in terms of, I got to get my hands dirty with some data, play with some other aspects, but it's really mostly I learn about things. I teach about said things, which is why I see my role more so as education.
Well, maybe going back a little bit here, we've got protocols, we've got networks, we've got base layer, we've got blockchains. This can get super confusing. How should we think through all these different terms and how they relate to each other? I mean, how do you think through that?
Yeah, this is valid because there's so much overlap. A protocol really is anything. Protocol could be a set of instructions. It can be a smart contract. It can be a set of nodes agreeing with each other, while a network in the crypto sense is what I refer to as a base layer in terms of this is where you launch things. This is where you build things. This is the underlying piece of infrastructure that lets you send currencies or add functionality on top.
I understand why it might make sense that someone like myself who's not technical, and then again, maybe some of the listeners don't understand and distinguish between all these different terms. And again, they're evolving, it seems. But maybe in your own research, I mean, are you coming across protocols, networks, whatever it is, representing themselves as one way and it's another? Or I mean, do you have to pay close attention to these types of factors given some of these complications and overlaps?
So marketing terminology is never what you want to use. And that's not to bash all the marketers out there. There is totally value in brevity over nuance. This is a fair trade in many circumstances. But when you're learning about something, you'll quickly see, is this the bottom layer of infrastructure that you're using, or is this built on top of some other infrastructure? So that becomes quickly apparent when you actually get into something, rather than just reading maybe the headline.
Red, if you think about the nature of protocols, since the time you got started at Messari doing your research to present, is there a story there or something interesting about the evolution or the changes or the future of protocols?
The space of protocols is ever evolving. I think what we've seen lately that has been popping up all over is the growth of DPIN and modularity. And I'll get into what both of those are. DPIN is an acronym for Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Networks. And if that sounds confusing, think of it as, instead of having a miner or validator that is only relevant to this crypto network, you have a piece of hardware in your house, something physical that is providing a service, whether it's, I'm not using my gaming computer right now, so I'm going to rent out the GPU. People can use it for what they want. Or I have a 5G internet hotspot in my living room and other people can use that internet. Or I have an exit node for a decentralized VPN. So instead of that one in the middle, we've got a bunch of them all over. So physical infrastructure in that sense, these are classic peer-to-peer protocols. People have tried to build many of these things before. The secret sauce was the financial incentive layer, which is crypto. It makes a lot of these possible. And then modularity would be, well, why am I building my whole set of infrastructure in one piece? If I separated it and I did my execution over here, but then I handled my consensus over there, couldn't I specialize each of those for that one function? Because if I use one piece of software to do everything, it can be a pretty good generalist. But if you want it to be a specialist, well, now you're closing the scope of what it can do. So modularity is this idea of, how do we separate these functions? And this is pretty popular in standard software development as well, where people want to break out different modules and plug and play with them and things like that.
Red, it seems to me that people always want to latch on to themes that are happening right now within the industry. And so you could argue that modularity, maybe restaking, certainly Bitcoin ETFs, these things are big themes right now that people are talking a lot about. So when you think about the research you're doing and you sort of try to understand what's going on in the industry as a whole, how do you think through the themes and what's going on?
So to answer this question, I'm going to zoom out a little and just point out how silly it is that we all care about infrastructure, right? Because you almost shouldn't care about infrastructure. If I'm using my phone and I'm on the Twitter app, if at any point I ever have to think about, is this built with React Native or is this built with Swift? If I ever have to think about that, the app sucks and it failed. So infrastructure is not supposed to be noticed. You're never supposed to think about it unless you're actually using it to build something. In crypto, it's all we talk about. And that's maybe because we don't actually have any use cases built on top other than fiat money tokenized on chain, which is ironic, and points programs maybe. So other than those, we don't have a ton going on, but that's one angle of, should we even care about this infrastructure in the first place, or how it's structured or how it's built? I, as an end user, just want to know, does this work for its purpose? Does this app work? And with that said, I agree, modularity has kind of faded a bit. Part of me thinks that's because it's realized the Ethereum space is completely modularized. It has realized that roadmap. You have a ton of other modular networks. Avalanche has subnets and Polkadot's got its parachains, and Bitcoin layers have exploded in the last 3 to 6 months with new ones popping up left and right. So there are still some integrated or monolithic chains like a Solana or an Aptos that are taking a different approach to building. But I think modularity has kind of faded because it's realized. And now people are looking to the exciting things that we are kind of just knocking on the door of.
If we talk about themes, it would be interesting to kind of group in what's going on in Bitcoin right now outside of the ETFs. And I'm thinking about this storyline about Bitcoin L2s. And this is something I'm still learning about. Something like stacks comes up a lot. And I looked in your research. I note that you're doing research on stacks, and I'll put a link in the show notes for anyone that wants to go look at that. But how are you thinking through some of the storylines emerging in the Bitcoin community?
Yeah, the Bitcoin space feels super exciting. Not that I've been around for 10 years, but it feels a lot more alive than it's been in a long time. And I'd say the attention came through two tech breakthroughs. So historically, for people that maybe hang out in other areas of crypto, Bitcoin is rather ossified and not changing very much. And on the opposite side of things, I think Ethereum's greatest asset is its willingness to change, because you had all these other networks come up with great ideas like Cosmos and Solana. They're saying we're going to be proof of stake. And then you have app chains, and then you have fee burning. And Ethereum said, oh, those are good ideas. I'm going to do that. And then Ethereum ate those Alt L1's lunches. And you had this happen because it was so willing to adapt. And that is how it kind of overcame a network effect. But Ethereum was only in that position in the first place because Bitcoin deferred programmability. Bitcoin chose to not have programmability. It's not that it didn't want it, and the community didn't want it. So NFTs and all these other narratives and sectors, they were deferred. They had to go somewhere else. They went to ETH. And now what we've seen is with ordinals, this is a meta protocol meaning part of it's on chain, part of it's off chain. But people realized, hey, we can index sats, which is the most atomic unit of a Bitcoin. We can index all the little bits and we can put them in order. And when we do that, we can attach data to them and make NFTs and make BRC20s, which are fungible tokens. And now we can do all our trading degen stuff. But Bitcoin had this air of professionalism that was apparently faked from the very loud maxis in the space that were saying, we don't want NFTs and those are all junk and we don't want any of that stuff. But then it became very apparent very fast once NFTs arrived that everyone wanted them. And the trading volumes were kind of nuts. If you count BRC20s, which are treated as fungible, but they're technically non-fungible, Bitcoin was blowing Ethereum and Solana combined out of the water in NFT trading volume at the end of 2023. And that's nuts. After all these years of the loud voices in the Bitcoin community screaming, we don't want that. That's not for us. You guys can trade that junk on your chains. So that kind of woke people up to say, wow, there's a lot going on here. We can do a lot. Maybe we haven't been paying attention. And that brought a lot of people back because BTC, the asset, maybe had a larger community than Bitcoin, the network, which are two separate things. If you think the asset and the network. And that playing field is getting leveled a little bit after ordinals being one to spike a lot of inspiration and BitVM being another very cool discovery, should I say. That was a paper written by Robin Linus of ZeroSync. It basically said, hey, we can make Bitcoin Turing complete. Technically, Turing complete means I can do whatever I want in terms of programming. If you're Turing incomplete, means you have limited functionality. So with BitVM, people realized, wait a minute, maybe I can actually have a lot more programmability than I thought. Maybe I can do things like verify proofs and have rollups. And these are ideas being explored that are totally not implemented yet. And we're maybe, a year or more away from, but it got the excitement back and it brought a lot of builders back. And there were some builders that were here basically the whole time. Stacks has been around for maybe 7 years at this point, the idea of Stacks. And it also brought a lot of new people. It is kind of a homecoming for all the undercover BTC maxis and other ecosystems. And they said, wait, I want to go build there. So now there's all these layers popping up. I'm hesitant to say layer 2, even though that's the accepted marketing term, because if we want to use the strict definitions from ETH world, there are almost no layer 2s. We have state channels like Lightning, some state chains, but largely we have side chains. And in development, some sovereign rollups potentially, but not live yet, so we can't count them. But that brought in a bunch of new builders and brought a lot of excitement into the incumbents that have been here building for a while.
As part of your research, and I imagine you're doing a lot of reading, you're meeting with teams, different things like this, have you developed an understanding of a framework or a playbook, if you will, for what drives or makes a protocol successful? I got to imagine there's some best practices or some things that you're picking up on?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So in terms of a playbook, one thing I'll say off the bat is cults work. There are a lot of cults in this industry, and that devotion really works to keep projects going and keep people building in them. Aside from that, I think a lot of us are LARPing about the ethos of this industry. Like, I like decentralization, so I'm here. It's not really the case. It really comes down to the bottom line of, is this affordable? Is there a good user experience? Crypto at large does not have a good user experience. And, we all know that if we've gone through the fumbling act of writing down keys and all this other stuff and having to approve tokens before we send them and all these other weird things. But it really does come down to that bottom line. And this is kind of like what I said about privacy, in that it's very reactive. Many people are in here for the ethos, but many others want to use some of these protocols and they don't really care if one's a little more centralized than the other. These things will eventually show their head and become a problem, but people are reactive, so they're not going to totally subscribe to that ahead of time. The reality in a lot of this is that price leads narrative is one thing I've learned. It's like when I first got in the industry and started learning about all this tech, I think I became a worse investor for a while. And I have decided for myself that if you learn more about the underlying technology without commensurate knowledge about people and their behavior, you will be a worse investor. You need to understand people too, because a lot of it is so illogical and so silly, and price really does lead narratives. When number go up, it gets people paying attention. It gets people wanting incentives. It gets people wanting to build in that ecosystem. And at some point, you typically catch up to that number and are deserving of it, or at least relative to the rest of the industry. But it is very counterintuitive that way. And then you start to realize, okay, yeah, that of course the best tech doesn't win. Kind of everything's marketing. I live in the States. Why are we using the imperial system? If everyone decided, let's use the metric system, it's not going to change overnight. There's a huge switching cost. If we were to do an analysis on languages and decide we should be speaking Esperanto, not English. Right now, English is kind of the global language for math and business and science. Well, good luck overturning that if you can factually prove that this other language is easier to learn and, better suited for this industry. It's just not going to happen. So you'll have these uphill battles, and a lot of it really comes down to marketing and inertia and network effects.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And you mentioned it there, but tokenomics must be part of this discussion about protocol playbooks or frameworks. And I'd like to just follow up on that and ask a question about how has your understanding of the role or the importance of tokenomics evolved as you've done your research at Messari and some of the projects that you've studied and published on?
Yeah, that's a good one. So tokenomics is something I'm still learning about. I come at this from a comp sci background. A lot of my colleagues come at this from a traditional finance background, which means I'll talk about, consensus algorithms and data structures all day and have fun with that. But I don't understand a lot of the core financial stuff as well. I'm trying to learn more about that. And tokenomics is one thing where, can't I just bet on the best tech? No, you can't. It also needs to have tokenomics that match it. I think people are learning from the mistakes of others where maybe things get diluted to all hell, or you just don't have the proper growth model to let new people in to build in that sense. Yeah, I won't dive into specific protocols, but I'll talk about a DAO that is in my city, and the token is just totally destroyed because it had a horrible inflationary mechanism, and now it's worthless. And it wasn't some huge DAO or project anyway. It was, a lot of guys that like to write code and brew beer. So it was a silly little thing, but the token is just abysmal. You can't save it. And, it's not on as large of a scale as a protocol that people use and put money into, but that's a good example of how you can kind of get wrecked if you don't think about your token, because you can't take it back once you put it out.
How are you thinking about the future of protocols? Obviously, there is a lot of discussion about L2s. We talked a little bit about L2s, quote unquote L2s in the Bitcoin community, and there's a proliferation of L2s in the Ethereum community. How should we think about the future of protocols?
The future of crypto, I'd say, is multi-chain, but this question's a bit more about protocols specifically. And I don't see protocols as financial tools at their core or anything like that. I know DeFi is our biggest use case, and a lot of people see crypto and they think this is money, or they think this is freedom. And I don't really see it as either. I see it as a substrate for social coordination. And at its core, that's what this tech is. Sure, money was the first use case to come out of it, which was Bitcoin. And then we had a lot of other financial applications come out of it, but it's really just social coordination. And there's an idea I like in psychology that's called the Dunbar number, I believe. And it's how many relations people can really have before you kind of hit your bandwidth. And it's maybe 150 or 200. If you think about your life, do you really know or keep up with more than that many people? Probably not. If you do, you have incredible bandwidth in your brain. But for our actual relationships that we're maintaining, that's about it. And that probably relates to sizes of tribes or just how we used to live before we were so globalized and we had the internet. But we don't really do well with those numbers. And if you have ever been in DAO, the first thing I learned is, wow, democracy doesn't work at scale. Like the participation sucked and people weren't cooperating and it's a mess. And then we move towards these systems where you have representatives, just like our government. We're like speed running government and DAOs, figuring out what works and what doesn't. But the point is you can speed run it because you can just whip up a brand new system. And that was so much harder to do before because you didn't have the reach. So it's actually super cheap to just spin up a new environment. You don't need to go do all this work in the physical world and spend all this time when you can kind of just copy, paste, and iterate and try things, which gives you this super quick turnaround, which we don't have in the real world. And it also gives us a sandbox that, let alone the speed, we just have a new environment to try it. So if I wanted to try partial common ownership or some different form of taxes and real estate, how am I going to do that? Am I going to go overthrow a government and implement it? No, me as an individual, this is confined to academia. You can make Monopoly. That was made for Harburger taxes, but no one uses it that way. So it's like, how do I get all these people to participate? With crypto, you could do that. You can get, as we've seen, millions of dollars in the line and thousands of people using these things in days. So the speed at which we can iterate and try new forms of coordination is so much faster than it's ever been for people because we have access to the internet, all these people, and we have credibly neutral platforms to do it on. So the future of protocols will be a lot more experimentation with social coordination. It's really just a substrate for that. That kind of comes from it being based on cryptography, which tangent on cryptography and why it's so cool is that it is one of the very rare things in our universe that is inherently defensive. If you think about everything that people build, or just most things in the universe, they're a lot easier to break than they are to build. So a life, very fragile, a human body takes a long time to build that up and then very fragile. You want to build a castle, it's going to take a lot of time and effort, but it might just fall over on its own from gravity or some other forces. So really everything is kind of easier to break, even our organization systems. But cryptography is so unique in that it is really hard to break cryptography and it is super easy to build it. So it's kind of got this inverse, inherently defensive property, which in my opinion really favors the individual over, a large organization. And that was kind of inherited in crypto, which is why you could do all these different types of social coordination and actually try things out and get real results there.
Longtime listeners of the podcast know that I've had other members of the Messari team on the podcast before. So, for example, had the opportunity to have Ryan Selkis, CEO and founder at Messari on, Vincent Wen, engineering manager, and Mihai Grigore over at the research team. So a really cool group. And I appreciate that you would come on and join. When you think about that core dev relationship between the Graph and Messari, how do you think about it?
I think the Messari and Graph partnership is pretty obvious in terms of how I explained Messari before. We are all for standards and adding transparency, and that totally lines up with the Graph. I mean, if you want to be accessing data from all these different places, you need standards, right? So the graph is providing the infrastructure, and Messari is providing some of the methodology, which is why Messari is a core contributor to a lot of subgraphs. And that the team is doing a lot of work to use that infrastructure and make it a little bit more accessible to other people who want to jump in. So it seems like a really obvious symbiotic relationship of here is the infrastructure and here is the aggregation.
Red, one thing that we sort of uncovered during our pre-interview and getting to know each other is there was a point where you connected directly with the graph community, and it happened at UC Boulder there in Denver, right around the time of ETHDenver last year, I believe. But that's an interesting story. Talk to us about what you did and how you partnered with the graph for a special event with students at UC Boulder.
Yeah, totally. So the graph was hosting a hackathon at UC Boulder, and I came over to the college and I gave a little presentation to all the students that were jamming on it and everyone else who was there to jam on the hackathon. I just taught a little about, hey, we at Messari are a core contributor to the graph. This is how we use it. This is why we think it's worth using. And, these are all the cool things you can do with it. And then, I hung around, helped some students out with hackathon projects and all that good stuff.
You made the move into crypto. You started freelancing. You did entrepreneur. Now you're at Messari. But you still made this move from one industry to the other. If you zoom out, what do you think makes the crypto industry different from other industries?
Crypto is so special right now because it's so young. And because it's so young, everyone who's here is here on purpose. You can't accidentally stumble into this industry. You can't go to college and say, oh, I don't know what I'll major in. I'll major in crypto because the curriculum doesn't exist yet, and except for maybe a couple schools. And then, oh, I don't know what I do. I got a degree in crypto. I'll go work in crypto. That's not really the case. You have to go learn about something else and join some other industry, and then make the conscious decision to leave that industry and join crypto. So everyone who's here actually wants to be here, which is not the case in almost every other industry where people just hate their jobs because they just fell into it. You don't fall into crypto. You have to make a decision to come here.
So, Red, I only have one final question for you before I ask you the GRTiQ 10. And it's a common question. I ask it all the time, but the different perspectives are super informative. And I'd like to ask you this question about Web3. Do you see it as an evolution, like a step of progress away from Web 2? Or you see it like a revolution, a revolt against what happened with Web 2 or something else?
I will equate Web 3 to decentralization in this answer in terms of what do I see it becoming? I don't know if it's exactly an evolution because I don't think we should be getting rid of our traditional centralized systems. In many cases, centralization is good. It's agile and it's fast. And it has many use cases where it's way better than decentralization. But it provides an alternative. So if you have no competition, why would you try to improve or get better? With the dollar, per se, I'm American, can't opt out of the dollar, just use another country's currency for all my stuff. I can't opt out. There's no competition. Crypto introduces competition. Now that there's something to compete with, adapt or die. You better give me a good deal. You better not inflate my money away at, 25% in the last however many years, whatever has happened with the money printing there. It's, hey, you better be honest with this because now you have competition, which means people can opt out of your system. So just having that alternative, I think, is enough to make centralized incumbents play fair. And if they don't, well, they get replaced. Pretty obvious there. The other side of it is, if you have a centralized system, it's really hard to decentralize it. If you have a decentralized system, you can totally centralize it later. Look at Farcaster. That is a decentralized protocol for social media, but Warpcast is a centralized client built on top. So there could be 40 different Warpcasts with their all, their own different flavor. Farcaster, which is social media. And you can easily become more and more centralized as you want on top, as long as the base layer is decentralized. So you can always build up. You really can't go down the gradient the other way. So I just see it as an alternative to keep current systems honest and to give us a little more flexibility in what we build.
Red, now we've reached a point in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10 questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week. And I hope it gives listeners the opportunity to learn more about you, but to also try new things, learn something different, or achieve more in their own life. So, Red, are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Oh, I'm so ready.
The GRTiQ 10. This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman was probably the book that had the most impact. I read that a very long time ago, but it got me going down a rabbit hole about cognitive bias and the difference between your subconscious brain and conscious brain. And I just think all that stuff's so cool.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
Not particularly, but if you are in the crypto industry, I do. And it is The Big Short.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
Discovery, Daft Punk. Easy.
What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
The best advice I was ever given was good things do not come to those who wait. Good things come to those who go and get them. I think the alternative version of that is sometimes you got to be an asshole.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know yet?
One thing I've learned that it feels most people have not learned is that you can be right or you can win, but you can't always have both. It's like that saying, do you want to be right or do you want to make money? It kind of falls into that category of this is the way it should be done. Well, do you want to achieve your end goal? You can be right or be happy.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
My personal life hack that I try very diligently to live by is create more than you consume. I think when you create, whether that be teaching or writing code or just working in industry at all, organizing a meetup, whether it's crypto or you like to go hiking or anything, contributing, creating will make you go so much further than if you are just a participant in the things you like to do.
And then the final three questions are complete the sentence type questions. The first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
Social coordination. We talked about it.
And the second one is, if you're on X, formerly known as Twitter, you should be following.
Yeah, I thought about this one and I didn't come up with any group or person to follow. I see a difference between being a fan of an idea and being a fan of a person. And I try very deliberately to never be a fan of a person or, company. You're kind of subscribing yourself to any future idea they might come out with. So I find it much safer to just get behind ideas and not people.
And the last one, I'm happiest when?
I'm happiest when I'm busy, like a border collie, like those herding dogs. I just love to have a lot going on.
The GRTiQ 10.
And I show you how deep the
Podcast.
Red Sheehan, thank you so much for joining the GRTiQ podcast and for sharing your story into Web3, the work you're doing at Messari, and a lot of other really interesting insights about protocols and the future of the industry. If listeners want to stay in touch with you, keep up on the work you're doing, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
Thanks so much, Nick. The best way to stay in touch is to find me on Twitter /X @RedVelvetZip.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTiQ Podcast. Roger that.